Okay, so before I begin, I can already tell you this is a video more for the diehard music nerds of my channel, but the less initiated will probably find this video entertaining as well. I really enjoy looking into these odd career pivots done by famous or reputable people. And even though Phil Collins was definitely the epitome of famous and reputable in the 1980s, his flame has burned out long ago and his music has been relegated to the adult contemporary bin or the Muzak playing above your head in the Walgreens. But it's Phil Collins' even lesser known former band that I want to talk about in this video. And they happen to be one of my favorite bands of all time. Genesis. Dude, this band kicked so much ass throughout so many decades of music, it's really kind of mind-blowing. Much like some kind of musical safety raft, they were able to just float above all of the other trends and fads in music while still retaining a hardcore dedicated fan base. Pop cultural tastes would change, of course, and the band would follow suit to a certain degree, but Genesis always retained their core prog rock weirdness. Unless it was a ballad, but I blame Phil Collins and the success of his solo career on those things. But nothing lasts forever, and bands eventually have to call it a day. I'm not sure how many bands dissolve gracefully, go out on a high note, or leave an audience wanting more, but Genesis sure as shit didn't. Stick around as we discuss the debacle that was the final album from Genesis, Calling All Stations. This is Dancing with Ghosts. Now, I've talked about this band at length on my channel in many videos. I mostly praise them as the geniuses that they are. However, I did criticize Phil Collins still trying to tour when he should really be in a nursing home at this point. And all the while, his bandmates Tony and Mike seem oblivious to Phil's withering condition. Like in this interview where Phil is clearly out of it and his bandmates are still sharp and lucid.
For those who didn't know, we rehearsed the whole production thing last November. During the lockdown.
I don't know, after, almost on the first day, once you start playing, Mike and I and Daryl, guitarist, we sort of seem to slot right back in where we were before, and it seems to work very easily.
Oh.
Which album is your favourite, do you think?
One?
Yes. Something different.
I don't know. I don't know.
Honest answer.
It's clear that there is significant mental decline, yet they still propped him up on stage for those last few live shows, which were a complete abomination in my opinion. Oh my god, am I getting off track. Anyway, brief history lesson. In 1970, Phil Collins started out in a band called Genesis at the age of 19. His initial position in the band was drummer and occasional backup vocalist. The band was fronted by the legendary Peter Gabriel, who would leave Genesis to pursue a successful and critically acclaimed solo career. Genesis kept chugging along with Phil Collins, taking on the role of lead vocalist while still performing the drum parts in the studio. Genesis may have lost some of their grit after the departure of Gabriel, but what they gained was a pop superstar in waiting. Phil Collins had a lightness about him as a frontman, never taking his role as lead singer too seriously. He was never going to be the brooding auteur that Peter Gabriel was, and he never pretended to be. Phil also wasn't afraid to sing a love song or two, and this was when Genesis found themselves breaking into the mainstream. Their first hit was a song called Follow You, Follow Me, another song that you've probably heard playing at a dentist's office or a drugstore. From this period on, Genesis would develop an ever-increasing pop sensibility that alienated their original fan base, but totally started bringing in the chicks. Genesis reached their peak pop zenith with their 1986 album Invisible Touch. But it was 6 years earlier that Phil struck out on his own, releasing the hugely successful Face Value album, which contained the mega hit In the Air Tonight. Phil's solo success would soon eclipse the success of his band, and to this day, many Genesis songs are mistaken for being a Phil Collins song, when it was actually the other members of the band who wrote the tune. For instance, many people think that this song is a Phil Collins song. Nope, Keyboardist Tony Banks wrote the song, Phil just sang the melody. Suffice to say, Phil Collins was very important in selling Genesis to the masses and keeping them relevant. After the massive Invisible Touch tour, the band would take a 3.5-year break to release solo albums. Genesis would release their last hurrah with Phil Collins as frontman and drummer on their 1991 record, We Can't Dance. This album performed relatively well on the charts, but in my opinion, you could tell the band were beginning to sound sleepier and were leaning more towards an adult contemporary direction with their overall sound. I'm sorry, did I say this was going to be a brief history lesson? My bad. After We Can't Dance, Phil Collins finally decided to leave Genesis. The reason for this departure is really anyone's guess. In the official press release, Phil claimed he was wanting to work on his solo career, but in a 2007 interview, Phil says he loved that time period of We Can't Dance because he was getting so much more of himself on that record than ever before, but then vaguely stated something about, quote, personal events colored the direction he went.
Certainly by the time We Can't Dance came out and by the time we did the tour, I had no intention of leaving. That was still, I was getting more of me out on that album and that tour than ever before. So it was just the personal events that coloured the direction that I went in.
So, I don't know, choose your own adventure as to why Phil left Genesis, but let's get to the meat and potatoes of this video. Genesis, after decades of hit records and a white-hot lead singer, they found themselves with only 2 original members and no singer. On top of that, the 2 remaining band members, guitarist/bassist Mike Rutherford and keyboardist Tony Banks, were both in their mid-40s. They were bordering on being seen as a legacy act, and in my personal opinion, they felt the need to inject some youthful energy into the new Genesis 3.0. Now, such a high-profile platinum-selling band like Genesis would surely bring in a known entity, a charismatic figure with some cachet behind their name. I mean, it would be absolutely insane to bring in an unknown to sing for one of the juggernauts of pop prog rock. So who did they choose to add to the hallowed halls of Genesis lead singers? Some singer from Scotland who fronted a paint-by-numbers alternative rock band?
Swing low in a dark glass hour, you turn and cower, see it turn to dust, move on a stone dark night, we take to flight, snowfall turns to rust.
Ladies and gentlemen, meet the strikingly mediocre Ray Wilson. This is Wilson's pre-Genesis band called Stiltskin. I guess like Rumpelstiltskin. I've known about Ray Wilson and his pre-Genesis band for a while now, and I just can't get over that name. I'm editorializing right now, of course, but Stiltskin? That just sounds like a band that an A&R guy would pass on. Nonetheless, Virgin Records had a Stiltskin record on hand to pass off to longtime Genesis manager Tony Smith. The band heard the record and were impressed enough to have Ray audition.
The new singer is Ray Wilson, who comes from a band called Stiltskin.
It has a sort of power and a passion that not all singers have.
Can anybody tell me?
Ray came down and he was very, very confident the first day, and I think impressed us. He sang some of the old songs, and it really worked.
So Wilson got the gig and the promotional machinery was engaged. Okay, so typically when a band is on the back nine of their career and something drastic happens, like a death in the band or a lead member quitting, if the band is crazy enough to try and replace that key member with someone else, 9 times out of 10, it is an abject failure. There was already precedence for this in the past. Sure, AC/DC lucked out, but that's only because Brian Johnson and Bon Scott had very similar vocal tones. Sammy Hagar kind of worked out in Van Halen, but most people consider the classic lineup as David Lee Roth handling lead vocals. Then there was the complete facepalm of an album, Van Halen 3, with Gary Cherone on vocals that failed miserably. Journey was so far from relevance by the time they replaced Steve Perry with Steve Algery that nobody even noticed. And we're just not going to talk about when Queen replaced the late Freddie Mercury with Paul Rogers. But with all that aside, here's Genesis 3.0 with new lead vocalist Ray Wilson.
From anywhere, where can I be? It's not about us anymore. It's all about the reasons that we think we're fighting for.
Kinda sucks, huh? First off, let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. Ray Wilson's voice does not sound like Genesis. I've heard people try to make the flimsy comparison that Ray had more of a Peter Gabriel tone to his voice, but come on, cut the crap. Ray Wilson bears zero resemblance vocally to Peter Gabriel. Ray Wilson's vocals were way too clean and vanilla to ever sound compelling in a band like Genesis. You know who the target audience is for a voice like Ray's? Christian rock fans. I honestly think Ray Wilson would have flourished fronting a Christian rock group. Seriously. Growing up, my mom would always buy those Wow compilations. It was a CD or cassette that was trying to compete with the Now compilations, only Wow contained all Christian music. And all the rock bands on those CDs sounded just like Ray Wilson. Can't be too edgy or else Satan might lead you into temptation. So yes, the vocals are very pretty sounding, but they're boring and vanilla as fuck to listen to. There's no musical box here.
You stand there with your fixed expression, casting doubt on all I have to say.
There's no mama here.
Now listen to me, mama, you're taking away my last breath. Sit down, take it away. Can you feel my heart?
There's just long swaths of drawn-out musical passages that never really go anywhere interesting. Now, this brings me to the fault of Mike and Tony, the two remaining original band members. They had started writing these songs way before Ray joined the band, and they even admitted they were writing music geared more towards a voice like Phil Collins. In fact, Ray had very little musical input at all. In an interview, Ray straight up calls the Genesis gig a job.
I got a call about the Genesis job. The Genesis job.
There wasn't much collaboration to speak of, and this was yet another downfall of this record. Phil explains it best.
Probably a lot of it didn't it washed over me. It didn't go inside, very easily, which is typical of Tony and Mike's material, I think. You see, this is where the three of us kind of had the best of all worlds, if you like, because, I'm kind of pretty immediate. Tony's kind of a little bit, you may not know it at the moment, but you'll probably be singing this to yourself in a couple of weeks' time, And then Mike is somewhere in the middle there. He'll write things that, not that immediate, but then, it's just a kind of, it makes the things deeper. It makes the stuff deeper when you've got the three of us writing. And I could see that there wasn't much of that immediacy there, which means people had to invest their time in listening to it. And I don't think people wanted to.
So without Phil as the more go-between immediate guy, you're left with Tony Banks, who is infamous for overcomplicating a song when left to his own devices. His box set was even called A Chord Too Far. Probably can't read it from here. Because in his own words, he says he felt like in his solo career, he always did just a little too much to overcomplicate a song that would have probably been a hit had he just left it alone. There's certainly plenty of this on this album, Calling All Stations. Verses that drag out, choruses that don't really feel like a chorus, outdated keyboard patches. I mean, come on, dude. That sounds like a Seinfeld jingle or something. Like, times had changed by 1997, and those plasticine 80s keyboard sounds were out in favor of more grittier sounds. Now, I'm not saying that Genesis should have emulated heavier bands by any means, but leave those cheesy little horn samples in the 80s, please. Anyway, Calling All Stations dropped in September of 1997 and did fairly well in Europe, but completely tanked in America. The album peaked at number 54 in the States, their lowest charting album since Selling England by the Pound, which came out all the way back in 1973. Now, back then, Americans were just stupid because Selling England by the Pound is a masterpiece. But by 1997, us Americans had wizened up to the generous chicanery and said no to Calling All Stations. Genesis would tour the new lineup in Europe, but sales were so soft in the States that the US leg was canceled. Pretty shortly thereafter, Tony and Mike decided that they didn't actually want to have to restart their careers all over again with a new singer and touring and sleeping in motels and basically starting like you're an original band that no one's heard of. The Genesis name did not have the cachet it did when Phil Collins was in it. So they just decided that enough was enough, went on indefinite hiatus. Ray was out and no future plans of touring or recording were in the works. The original Genesis lineup, on the other hand, would convene sometime in the early 2000s for a photo shoot to promote their Genesis Archives CD box set. Talks were had, but the ever-stubborn Peter Gabriel was just not interested in going back to the past, unlike another fan favorite of this channel. But Phil, Tony, and Mike were all keen to give it another go, and in 2006, Genesis announced that they would tour again with the Phil Collins era lineup. Incidentally, these tours would slowly drain Phil's life force, leaving only a sad husk. Ray went on to milk his time in Genesis for all it was worth by doing solo concerts where he would perform Genesis songs.
I can see you, mama, but I can hardly wait.
To an audience who probably thought, well, I can't see Genesis live, I can't see the musical box. So I guess this will have to do. Honestly, Ray came out of the other end of this whole ordeal seeming a little bit bitter. First, there was the whole bit about him calling it a job instead of a gig or my former band.
The Genesis job.
No, this was just a job to him. A job that made him compromise his lackluster alternative rock band at that. Something he wishes he could go back and do differently.
I guess soon after that, I started to think about it and thought, is this really for me? You know, I'm not really a big fan of Genesis. I don't really know all that much about them. Is it something I should be doing? And I'd also been recording or writing an album, the first album after Stiltskin's record. And I just finished it, so I was really quite passionate about what I'd been writing. And didn't want to stop. But of course you're faced with, singing with one of the biggest bands in the world, or just carrying on in your kind of small career. And I think in hindsight, a big part of me wishes I'd carried on with my career.
But hey man, he's way more successful than me, so get it however you can, Big Daddy. In retrospect, Ray and the rest of the band also felt like they could have made a really strong second record by starting from scratch with Ray being present and contributing, but the guys were getting older and they just didn't feel like it after seeing the poor performance of the first Ray Wilson record. Concert footage exists of Ray during the Genesis tour in Europe, and it's fucking weird seeing someone on stage with Mike and Tony that isn't Phil or Peter. Anyway, that's all I got on this bizarre final chapter of the Genesis discography. What did you think about this album? I think There Must Be Some Other Way is probably my favorite track off of this album if I had to pick one. I mean, the album itself is in no way as bad as some of the other musical abominations I've covered on this channel, but just seeing a band that was so dynamic and amazing end in such a mediocre way was quite disconcerting, very disappointing, and I don't know, just left a bad taste in my mouth. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Until next time, have a good rest of your night.